Om Namah Shivaya. Mukam Karoti Vachalam. I've already hopefully disabused you of any notions around eminence and enlightenment, but also created the scope for a dialogue. Because this is not so much about the notions of credentials, this is about the criticality of the dialogue. Whatever we talk about, whether we are referring to Indian knowledge systems, we're talking about civilization, civilizational policy making. In the first session, I tried to provide perspective on cognition and cognitive shift and why that is critical to solve the integral and integrated global crisis. Because the global crisis is not one crisis, it is a multi-crisis. It is a confluence of different things, but all of that can be traced back to fundamentals of human behavior and the eternal challenge of how human societies come together to collaborate. And this session, for those of you who've been part of the earlier session, I hope to make it a continuity. For those of you who are joining this for the first time, I hope to make it self-contained, but at the same time relevant and meaningful. Like I mentioned in the morning session, it's important that we reflect on certain questions. And the entire endeavor is really to start looking at the world and have opinions about everything in the world rooted in an Indian worldview or a Dharma drishti. And what do we mean by this? And what is the role of policy making? And how do we look at policy making that is civilizational in nature and policy making for civilization? I will try and locate that obviously in the context of education and Indic knowledge systems, which is where most of our work is. But I'll also try and take a macro view of what policy making itself is. What are the worldviews that dominate policy making? What is the Indian way of thinking about policy? And then have a conversation on where we see a confluence and how do we represent this and talk about this to our students and our colleagues. That's the sort of outline that I have in mind, but I'm very, very comfortable with detours. In fact, on this question of civilizational policy making and civilizational design thinking, because I come from that world of design, art and technology and product development, we are very comfortable with ambiguity and emergence. And that is also the macro leap of Dharma. And it is best represented in the idea of the word roadmap itself. I've spoken about this in one of the conversations I had. Roadmap is a very interesting word that all of us must have come across and used countless number of times, right? Because every single thing that you talk about, you are asked to make a project. If you are good at your work and if you take a problem, then you get a project. I don't know if it has happened to you, but typically that is the experience. And the minute you get into a project, you're asked to come up with a roadmap. Now, roadmap actually juxtaposes two opposing ideas. Road is a linear entity. It gives you markers along the way. It is straight, you would know where you are. Map is a network of roads, right? You can arrive at the same point through multiple different paths. But this is combined into something which in a way also is reflective of how our idea of time and causality has been in a way confiscated and hijacked. Because we think that everything is linear and everything will stick to the schedule. And when we are faced with problems that do not adhere to the script, which is essentially the macro problems of ecology, of immigration, of loneliness, of violence, they do not adhere to script because they are as unpredictable as human nature itself. Then we are confounded. But the idea of roadmap is that you should be comfortable with both predictability and some amount of unpredictability and emergence at the same time. And like in the words of Scott Fitzgerald, who said this, that the actual representation of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold opposing ideas and still remain functional. It's very critical that we are expansive in the true sense of the word, that we allow for new ideas to come and reside in folders, and we do not presuppose or prejudge the value of an idea. And the habit that we can have of actively seeking out positions that are in opposition to our beliefs is the fundamental trait of a critical thinker, which to me is the representation of Dharma and civilizational thinking. That you are able to look at the opposites harmonize that, at the same time transcend. I've mentioned this in the first session as well. The Dharma Drishti is something that is constantly looking at the world and looking at the principles behind, the operating principles behind the phenomenon, and is able to reconcile that with the knowledge system that we have. And unless we are able to do that, the challenge that we have of representing the value of Indian knowledge systems, both intellectually and morally, this is very important to realize. Today, the mind and heart of a young person is kindled only when you speak to the heart and then go to the mind. Because liberal ideology, like I've mentioned in the morning, and I take a very active position on this, has actually hijacked our critical thinking and substituted that with a performative, self-congratulatory culture. So you're speaking against a very large, active, powerful global culture, which is able to give very easy entry points for masses across the world to feel good about ourselves by just getting engaged in it. When you know, I see a lot of young people. I was talking to somebody at Ayud. We fail not just as teachers, but even as conscientious young people. We are not able to talk about the power of our culture because you're speaking against the zeitgeist. The minute you say culture, it is in their mind equated with archaic. You say culture, they are listening archaic. You talk tradition, they are listening oppression. You talk dharma, they are talking about religion and anti-secular. So you're speaking against the zeitgeist. The words have been hijacked, the meaning has been taken away. So when we talk about policy making, it has to go back to the fundamentals of the architecture of meaning making itself. So while I talk about policy and policy making and some of the challenges, my perch, my intention and my endeavor is always to try and clarify the story of Indian knowledge systems in a way that we can evoke empathy of the people that we want to learn, who want to engage with Indian knowledge systems. How do you really relay the anxiety of that young person who is setting out on her life, and you're telling them that there is culture, dharma, there is tradition, because it doesn't talk to that person at that age, right? So there's also a temperament that we need to curate when you're in this, that you plant the seeds and the seeds will take their time, but they will. And I'm mentioning this to a few of us who were talking yesterday. The way I look at my work and my organization's work is, if you are going out into the world, we'll try and give you a few maps of meaning to make sure that you don't get too lost. But lost you will, because that's the nature of the world and that's the nature of any engagement. When you come back, there is the cradle of civilization ready for you so that you don't fall beyond redemption. And when you're coming back, we will light the paths on your way back. We will remain open. So when we say civilization is that macro entity of empathy. It is that cradle that holds all of us. I want us to hold that image of a cradle that all of us belong to. And when we say Indic knowledge systems, it is not an academic pursuit alone. It is a moral pursuit. It is an intellectual pursuit. It is, of course, grounded in academic rigor and discipline and openness. But it is for the fundamental act of meaning making for life itself. So that's where I come from philosophically and temperamentally. Now we talk about civilization and civilizational public policy. This is important to decode and deconstruct a little bit. Policy, I think all of us are familiar with. Right? I'm sure you have policies. Somebody mentioned biometric is coming. That's a policy. Right? We start our sessions with an invocation to the divine. That is a policy. That's a cultural policy, right? We speak in a certain way. We introduce. There is a formal, vote of thanks and all of those protocols. That is a policy of the organization. So basically, just because we don't have too much time to have a dialogue on some of these things, but fundamentally, we can all agree that policy is a set of actions prescribed towards certain objectives, so that all of us have some kind of conformity of meaning. Not necessarily discipline in an imposed way, but we all draw meaning from that. Before we get to civilization and civilizational public policy, we need to talk about culture. How do we define culture? Because culture is the bedrock from which you can talk about a civilization in its highest level of sophistication. How can we think about culture? Any ideas or any quick definitions, thoughts, words that come to your mind when you think about culture? Anyone?
It's accumulated.
Accumulated, which means that there is a co-creation process involved in culture. Anything else? It doesn't need to be a clear definition, but just words that come to our mind when we think culture.
Festival.
Festival. That's a great thing because there is a visceral component of culture in festivals. This whole thing of people coming together happens in festivals.
Heritage.
Heritage, all your intellectual inheritance and cultural inheritance, definitely yes. Harmony, yes. So these are all the abstracts or some properties associated with culture. If you are to get a little bit more particular about culture, they are patterns of behavior with a shared meaning. That if I say namaste, it is decoded as respect. If I do this in a culture that does not have this experience, it does not mean a thing. I can do this and know that it will be decoded exactly with the intention that I have in mind because there is a macro called culture that has brought you and I together. And that is learnt. So these patterns of behavior and meaning making is learnt through interactions. So culture is participative. Culture is co-creation. Culture is by expanding yourself into new fields of activity and interaction. Right? So patterns of behavior with symbols, with meanings, with rituals, all of them actually signifiers, which are learnt by interaction in social groups. So these are all the characteristics of a culture. Now there is a danger that we sometimes mistake these shibboleths or the ornate parts of culture for the deeper meaning. For example, if we talk about culture today, oh, I love traveling. Sure. I love food. Sure. These are all markers of self-identity. That is not a culture yet. It is an element of culture. Travel, food, dress, that is an element of culture. But culture in its deeper layer is what comes to us as lived experience realities that help us experience and internalize and embody the highest metaphysics of the land. For example, this was a very moving incident recently after the Odisha train accident. Absolutely unrelated people went and offered death rituals to the people who departed. They tonsured their heads, they did a one-day vrata, they did their puja. That is culture. Because they understood that the final rites of those people who departed in that really unfortunate, sad accident were not performed, could not be performed because families perished. But they also realized that in our worldview, in the worldview of this land, your end is very important because there is something else that happens after that. There is a soteriology, the transmigration of the soul. There is also an eschatology about what happens in terms of salvation. All of those we have. But that is not left at that philosophy level. It is not a speculation. It is lived. That is why without any organization, without any authority, without any centralization, a group of people went all by themselves and they conducted the rituals where they tonsured their own heads. They were not worried about how they look. They were not worried about how other people will think about it. They just understood that it is the right thing to do as an act of offering to those who were unfortunate, and they did it. That can only happen in culture. Whether it is sustainability, whether it is any other problem that you're looking to tackle, right now in public policy, the importance of culture is finally being recognized. And I'll talk about the evolution of public policy in that context. Right? But this is important. So culture is set of social interaction-led meaning-making mechanisms through rituals, symbols. But it is not just at the food and dress level, it is at a deeper level. Let's look at that meaning. Next is civilization. We are trying to unpack each of the word. Very, very important that we pay attention to the definitional clarity of each word. If that is culture, what is civilization? Right? We all understand what, we understand in a lived sense what civilization is. But to try and formulate it in a slightly more rigorous way, when a culture reaches a level of sophistication and develops technology, instruments and institutions of transmission, and intergenerational clarity around what the meaning of that is over large periods of space and time, then you can call that a civilization. Civilization will always have certain culture. There can be many cultures. Not all cultures can become civilizations. Right? We only have 16 or 21 civilizations, depending on which reader or which historian you're talking about, right? So civilization is a certain level of sophistication in institutions. Think about family. Vivaha, one of the greatest institutions, right, across all cultures, but definitely in this land. The kind of value that is given to that grihastha as the ashrama that makes all other work possible. Whether you are a vanaprastha, whether you are a sannyasi, whether you are a balya, it is the grihastha that sustains everything else. And that is the architecture of dharma, which is diversity. Knowing that there are life stages and there are also different kinds of proclivities, and how do you create interdependency between the disparate, and how do you create coherence amongst those. That level of sophistication, when you think about family and grihastha as one, think about Gurukula as an institution. It does not, and I spoke in the morning session about the wonder of wonder. Right? We don't wonder enough, and I was talking to a few of you. How do we really get our young people interested in Indian knowledge systems? Certainly by not talking about the greatness of it directly. It does not, because it's a natural tendency to reject that kind of credentialism. You're talking against the psychology. It has to be connected to something that they have as a question. And that question has to be allowed to be explored to its fullest, even if it is coming from a different worldview. And from there, you should be able to connect it to a different and a deeper way of looking at it, which is always available when you think about it from an Indian civilizational worldview, simply because we've had a greater experience of dealing with these questions in detail, and we had diversity which informed that, coming from different knowledge streams. Right? So this institution of Gurukula, institution of temple, as the center for multidisciplinary mind. I mentioned the Indian mind is a pattern-seeking mind. It is a mind that looks at fractals. It's a mind that looks at the patterns in nature and creates that. The entire temple architecture, I'm sure some of you are masters at it, some of you must have studied it, is a representation of that. In the yajna, it's the Agni which is taking our consciousness and sending it to the sky and offering it. In the temple, that is what is happening. You have the Garbhagriha and you have the Kumbha. The consciousness that is rising from below and the consciousness that is descending from above, both of them meeting there. That is the fundamental architecture of this one. Imagine the sophistication of a culture that understood these metaphysics and did not put the burden of all of that intellectual, analytical understanding on everyone. Rather, it just created a space where we can just go partake and we will get the benefit. The idea of festival or utsava. In an utsava, the utsava murti goes to the last person in the village. On normal days, you go to the temple and you have access to a certain area of a temple depending on you, right? But once a year, there was an empathy in that design that the utsava murti goes all over this one, so that nobody should be left untouched by divinity. That is an institution. That it understood the deep truth and created mechanisms of transfer generation after generation after generation. Our students today do not wonder about it because we haven't wondered about it. I walk down this path, I'm sure, in not more than 2-3 kilometers, I will find something that has been there for 800 years. A small temple or a small ritual or a small community or one tree which has been respected or, which is sacred. You will find it invariably in any part of Bharat. Now, it took me the cognitive shift in my own experience to ask, I try and create a ritual in the team, because when we work in game development, the holy grail in games is how do you make people come back time and again. I gave the example of the Simpsons notification, but what reasons can you give for people to come back, right? So there is progression, there is skill, there is leaderboard, there is competition. There could be many design elements that we introduce. But the pursuit is retention and engagement. It is the holy grail because it is so difficult. Especially when we are cluttered with choice, like I mentioned in the first session, people don't have time, they don't have the attention. We are living through an economy where we've monetized attention. And since all of us are monetizing attention, we don't have the attention for anything, right? We've monetized and we've economized our attention also. But that is the challenge of any product developer, that he has to create something that will engage people on a repeat basis. Same thing in a classroom, same thing, if I'm having a session, if you listen to me the next time, how do I make it engaging is the challenge that I will have, right? Now this engagement problem has been solved for 800 years, 1000 years. The same ritual has been continuing. If you create something and if you know the pain of entropy, of how things actually come down, then you will understand the genius of something that sustains. Sustainability is not just about some abstract that's happening as a theory for economy or ecology separately. Sustainability is about everyday human behavior. It is behavioral. And that meaning is supplied by culture. And in civilizations that are sophisticated, you have an institutional transmission of that meaning. That's how it sustains. Then we can look at public policy. So we have policy as a set of actions towards objectives. You have culture as a way of interacting and making meaning and learning through interaction so that we can decode the same behavior. You have civilization as the highest or the most sophisticated form of one culture or many cultures which have solved for the problem of continuity, transmission, and intergenerational meaning making. Now we are talking about public policy. How is public policy distinct from any other policy? Simply that public policy is the act of the state. You can have a policy in Amrita, we can have a policy in this meeting room. When state becomes the arbiter, that becomes public policy. Is this acceptable? Is this clear why or what we are talking about, right? So when we say civilizational policy making, we are asking the question, how can the state become the agent for civilizational wisdom? And therefore there are challenges to deal with. Even before we get to NEP or education, there are challenges. Now what are these challenges? Let's look at sustainability or ecology as a challenge. What is the political structure that we have today? Within the country it is democracy in most of this one, that is the highest form of organizing. And across the world it is the structure of nation states. We all agree, India is a nation state, Pakistan is a nation state, US is a nation state, and we'll talk about nation and state briefly. I don't have the time today to get into the details and the history of it. But fundamentally, the structure that we have is, there is democracy, free market, the liberal worldview based institutions, and the world is organized as nation states. Take any of the big problems today and let's think through if they can be solved through this political structure. Climate change. What is the essential challenge of climate change? That you have an extractive economic model. That your economic model today depends on financial structures which value you quarter on quarter, which means that you need to engage in extractive activities, which in economics we say actions that have negative externalities. But the negative externalities for those of us who are not used to economic reasoning, if I smoke, somebody else who is inhaling the air is affected. So my act of smoking is not just bad for myself, but it produces a negative externality because somebody else is negatively impacted by it. Whereas education has a positive externality, right? Because if I get educated, then chances are that other people will also benefit from it. So from a public policy perspective, the economic reasoning thinking is anything that has a negative externality has to be taxed. Anything that has a positive externality has to be subsidized. This is how general prescription for state action is. This is all very well within the confines of one nation state. But climate change does not lend itself well to this. China is building a dam because it suits the interest of that nation state. But in doing that, it is altering the natural flow of very, very high altitude, very critical river and water flow systems, which will have downstream consequences for Bangladesh and India. We might get submerged. Some parts of this one might get submerged. How will we solve this problem with the notion of nation state? We see this. There is a fundamental challenge. This is basically not my theory, it is Danny Roddick. He calls this the inescapable trilemma. He says that there are three opposing forces that global leaders are trying to grapple together, but they cannot tackle all three of them together. At best, they can tackle two. What are these things? Globalization as a force, nation state as a political entity, and democracy as an aspirational value of organizing societies. Let's just understand this a little deeper, because this conceptual clarity is critical when we talk about public policy. What is the idea of democracy? At a basic level, it is the will of the majority. That if most of us want a certain thing, others who might not be okay with it will still have to be okay with it. That's how we can coexist. Otherwise, we'll have to kill each other. Right? Anarchy is this one. The whole progress from anarchy and barbarism, there's a lot of colonial baggage there, but let's keep that aside for a while. To this act of adult franchise and selecting our governments to represent our interest, and finally coming to some understanding that there is a change of power. We get to vote once every 5 years in our country, depending on which country you are in, and the will of the majority will prevail, others have to accept, right? Which means that it is by nature populist. It is by nature this one. That is why the discourse of majoritarianism, because it is a genuine concern that if it is only the will of the majority, then the majority can describe anarchic rules and keep the oppressed as oppressed forever, right? That is why you also have constitution, which is supposed to represent the idea of governance in a republic spirit, right? Even if you have a majority government, they cannot do everything as they please, because their actions are subject to constitutional scrutiny. So there is the power of the will of the people. Now think about a policy that says Kerala, I don't know, rubber might be this one, right? Rubber production is a key element of Kerala economy, right? Now there are two policies that the government can have. It can create an export market by subsidizing and by creating incentives for people to export, not taxing it. Or it can also support by making sure that no rubber is imported into the country, right? So that you have all the domestic market to yourself. These are government actions. When we say public policy and state actions, this is how policy impacts anything in the region. Now let's say we now have a global scenario where we are likely to get into a war with China. Assuming, God forbid, it should not happen, but let's assume for a minute it happens. And so we need to find alliances. And one of the important alliances, Vietnam, Philippines, whatever country that you fancy. And they have surplus of rubber. So the nation state interest there has to override the democratic interest in Kerala. You will go to them at the table and say, we will import rubber from you, we will give you economic exchange by taking rubber, because that is what you are producing, we will take that. You see how nation state and democracy are at loggerheads with each other, right? Now you add the idea of globalization. The idea of globalization is that you produce and you have global markets. The capital moves freely, the labor does not move freely. That is why immigration, you have H1B visas at a cap, but foreign currencies should keep coming into your country because they can then dictate the policy and all of that. Now if you are a global MNC and let's say you are Facebook today, right? And you are an arm of the US state because it's also power at the end of the day. And you want free access to all the countries. You want freedom of speech, you want all of those nice sounding words, right? You want the world to have just one value system so that this becomes easier. Now the challenge is if a nation state has its own laws which say that we will not allow you. Which means that then, or if the nation state like India has 20 different languages, each of that addition is a new cost to the company. It is nation states that rise what we call transaction costs. So these three things are always at tension. So the decisions that leaders can make is, I will either subdue democracy and get globalization and nation state together, or I will subdue nation state and I will go with democracy and globalization, but I will not talk about borders. This is the paradox that people have. And none of our big challenges, because we are in this nation state, we are optimizing always for the lower end. I will only do things that are valuable to me as a nation state. But in that case, if I am generating something that is negative to the world, I do not care. But the problems we have are the problems of global commons. Ecology and environment cannot be solved with each nation doing its own thing. In fact, if let's say they are doing iron ore mining, the impact of that will be faced by other countries. What are they doing in the West? All of these things we now change phones very frequently. This comes from very, very deep and horrendous mining that happens in certain parts of the world. We generate tremendous e-waste. And if you look at the world sustainability ratings, you will have a few countries that are always on the top, particularly the Eastern European nations, always have very, very high ratings in sustainability. How do they do it? They do it because they export all their waste to poor nations. They use poor nations as dumping grounds for e-waste. So they have created mechanisms of ratings where they are able to export all the sources of the problem to others and just represent the benefits of that in the rating. And because that rating is high, they get more investment. And because they get more investment, they can keep on raising technology. And because they keep raising technology, they can create new markets. This is the way in which the complex world in which sustainability itself is located. The entire sustainability literature, if you look at SDG, in fact, there is something called a great redesign within the SDG original document itself. It is a compact of the elites with the elites that our business should not be impacted. Whatever you do, our MNC business should not be impacted. The rest is just vocabulary that you and I are using mostly. The challenge is how do we actually have a system which does not reject the negative externality. That is the system of Dharma. Dharma is generating positive externalities. I spoke about Dharma as the act of creating surplus. Surplus with ourselves, surplus with our relationships with each other, surplus with nature, surplus with the biosphere, all of those things. Right? Today, you are not able to understand Dharma in a sustainability context because the language has obfuscated. So, the pathway to reclaiming civilizational public policy is also through language, is through oral traditions, is through stories, is through meaning making that is intangible in the cultural heritage of communities, how they have made meaning for themselves. Right? That is the Indian knowledge system. The moral and intellectual case for Indian knowledge system is that it is the only knowledge system that has the lived experience, the philosophy and the culture together to offer solutions to the global grand challenges of ecology, environment, migration. Take loneliness. I have spoken about this one, the abundance of choice leading to a poverty of attention. Think about this paradox. Today we are living through a time of the greatest choice that is available to us, from Swiggy and Zomato to different kinds of phones, and everything is available. But all of that has led to a poverty of decision making and attention. Can you realistically, anybody in this room, say that we've gotten greater focus as a result of this? And that goes back to the question of what is freedom. Like I mentioned, in a certain civilization, freedom means freedom too. If that is your definition of freedom, you will keep producing relentlessly. In our civilization, when we say civilizational policy making, we are talking about state action that can deliver freedom from. There are certain things that we will have to stop doing. Period. There is nothing. This one, right? And why will you stop doing that? Only if you have a philosophy that tells you that it is the right thing to do. Because ultimately, the story of my life is in my head. I want to know that I am doing the right thing and I am progressing on a path. That path can either be a happiness path driven by materiality, or it can be a purushartha path, which is driven by balance and harmony. So, in one word, if you want to talk about civilizational public policy, it is how can state become an agent of purushartha. Because the human experience is such that we have to have material expansion, We have to have financial well-being. We need to have sensual well-being. We need to have experiences that elevate us. We need to have both of that in the rubric of dharma. What is dharmic consumption? It's very important. And gurus have given great definitions for this. Some consumption, when it satiates your need and your chitta is calm, that is dharmic. If by consuming something your chitta is not satiated, it creates the next samskara, the next vritti to keep having it, that is adharmic. And this can only happen when you have, like I said in the morning session, when you have a multi-life metaphysics of moksha. If I have only one life, why should I not consume? And if 10 billion people consume, can we have a planet? At the same level, if all of us are aspiring for the American quality of life, how are we talking about sustainability in the same breath? Simply not possible. We don't have the material resources. Nature requires time to recreate. Economic models do not have the time to wait. Because your financial results are quarter to quarter, nature cycles are 4 years. Sustainable agriculture means that you have to leave the soil like that for 4 years at least, or 8 years in some cases. And that is where the culture of dharma has distributed many, many practices of lived wisdom to make sure that the nature gets time to heal. There's a beautiful word called Godan. It actually is a Krikarna of do stan. A cow has udders, 4. Dharma tells you you can only take milk from 2, and the other 2 you have to leave. Why? Because that is for the calf. That is for nourishment of something else. That is not your property. This is culture. This is the ability, this is the wisdom to live with nature in a manner that is sustainable. You're not going to get sustainability through any other theory. It's only through culture that we're going to get sustainability, right? So with that backdrop, I'll just pause here if we are clear on the necessity and the criticality of civilizational public policy. State is the number one actor. You and I cannot solve the great challenges. It has to, education for example, all of us can lament about education, but unless it became part of NEP as IKS, we don't even have the possibility of this dialogue. It is because state has created that as a policy that we are somebody who is adjacent to the entire university system. I am not a scholar here, right? You are the scholars. But I am able to have a dialogue and express my thoughts because there is something called a policy instrument. That is why it is critical. And I'll talk about how we think at Brhat about IKS. But is this clear in terms of policy? What is policy? What is culture? What is civilization? And why is civilizational public policy critical? We all have to become strategic thinkers in this, of how these things come together. This is the act of leadership that IKS needs. That you take the knowledge system, you take your understanding of your subject, but you also understand how it resides within a larger context and what actions will help you drive that. I'll pause for a minute and then we can, if you have thoughts or questions, we can take that and then I'll continue. It is because clearly it says that in the NEP document it talks about the real knowledge of self, right? And it talks about the civilizational knowledge systems.
Just to make my own.
Yes, it is. It is an act of state.
One other example is I'm thinking.
Yeah.
In monsoon times we ban trolling, the fishing, the
Yeah.
still fishing.
Yeah.
Is it also a kind of civilization based?
That can.
In Kerala, I think most of the coastal Karnataka,
Yeah.
Kerala, Tamil Nadu.
So if it is coming from a lived experience of people and a wisdom that has been accumulated, which the state is respecting, absolutely yes, it is civilizational policy making. Right? So for example, some of you might be seeing the act of violence that's happening in Manipur. Right? Now there are civilizational issues there. It's not just a war of region, it's a war of religions. Right? There are many, many intricacies to that. So unless you look at yourself as a civilization, you will not be able to deal with it. It will not be pleasant all the time. It will be, because reality is not pleasant. So basically when we say civilizational policy making, we are saying that the role of the state in the Indian imagination is something that helps purushartha sadhana. The state is supposed to be an enabler of pursuing the fourfold aims of life. So we have to ask ourselves where this is happening, where this is not happening. right? Which policy of the state is helping me get, or which policy of the state is not helping me, or how can I help the state create a policy like that? Which again, this is a lifelong thing. Policy making is the highest. If you look at any system, because ultimately this is systems thinking, at the lowest level of the system is what we call artifacts. So when we started this session, for example, right, we created a flyer. That is an artifact. Yeah. The next level of sophistication is artifact plus experience. Experience means I can share it, I can click on it, I can represent it, I can put it as my DP if you give me a WhatsApp, this one. So that is an artifact plus experience. So it is already increasing the value of reach network. At the next level is the rules that are laid out. That you need to come by this time, we'll come like this. Then there is order to that. Artifact, experience, and experience that is leading to order. Right? At the highest level is policy. For example, the fact that this is happening in this room with the School of Culture and Spiritual Studies, that is a kind of a system that you have, that you've designed. Right? There is a school, it can call external people and we can have a conversation, that is a system. At the highest level is the idea of university and national education policy, which is making this possible. So we need to think about each of these elements all through. What is the policy? What are the institutional rules that we can do to make that policy legible? So there is NEP. In Amrita University, you have the instrumentality of School of Culture, where IKS can be brought into. Then you need to think about what are the artifacts and experience. This series of conversations you are having is an example of an artifact and experience. At the level of a poster, that is just an artifact. Every single thing that we do, we will have to think about it. This, if you are able to look at all these things together, that is Dharma. That is the dharmic drishti, because then you know the interlinkages between things. How things progresses and transforms from one thing to another. And what is the ultimate potential of that? Dharma is realizing potential. Right? How do you create pathways for people and situations to realize potential? That is the idea of this one. So let's look at a few more definitions around this. So whenever we talk about public policy, politics and purpose, theories and models, I can get deeper into this, but you're thinking about things at a larger level than yourself. Not just yourself as one person, not just as family or Amrita, but higher. You're talking about society, talking about economy, you're talking about nations and governments, but all of that representing the interest of the individual. Right? That is the important thing. I'll not get too much into this. There are many ways in which this have been called. We will talk about what is the difference in our imagination of a civilization versus the civilization of this. But fundamentally, state is something where we have given the monopoly of violence. This comes to us from Weber, that if there is a riot happening here somewhere, only police employing gun violence is legal. Other people employing that is not legal. When you reach that understanding, that is a state. That you transferred some of your authority to one authority to protect all of us, and they have monopoly of violence. Otherwise, it is anarchic state. All of us, whoever is more powerful wins. So we've transferred some of the agency, which is the theory of social contract, to that. Right? So it has some external control, it has an idea of sovereignty, it has organization, and everybody who is part of that willingly says, I will abide by this. Law is there because we abide by it. If 1 billion people say we don't abide by law, then there is no law. We've all come together through our human experience and culture that this is the way in which we can live together. Right? And to maintain that, we've created a certain institutions. That is so. I'll not go deeper into this. This is, if you're doing a larger course on public policy, I'll talk a little bit. But from a civilizational perspective, the principle is always swabhava, swadharma alignment. In anything, right? Sustainability is basically when your swabhava and swadharma are aligned. This is important. Ultimately, what we're doing is the act of managing complex change. And managing complex change from a public policy perspective, from a systems perspective, is a combination of 5 things. You need to have the vision. right? NEP, for example, has the vision of an education grounded in Indian knowledge systems. But now we are asking ourselves, do we have the skills? Do we have the skills to manifest that vision? Do we have the faculty? Do we have the courses? Do we have the literature available? Do we know which discipline, which subject goes into? Those are skills. Are there incentives? Why should somebody who's already trained, I'm sure a lot of you are from that, why should you go into Indic knowledge systems? Because you found your meaning already. What is the incentive? Right? That incentive could be a civilizational incentive, it could be a personal incentive, but we need to articulate responsibly what those incentives are. Then we need to create resources, opportunities like this to have a dialogue, to listen to each other, this time that we are getting at university's expense. All of these things are, I was called in, there's some expense to the center, all of these are resources. And finally, some action plan. That we come here, we have this discussion, but it leads to something that we know we can do in 30, 60, 90, 180 days. That in 180 days we want to have a certain course in a specific discipline, or we want to have a framework for engaging in sustainability from a Dharma perspective, whatever your area is. In the absence of any of this, you have very different outcomes. If you have skills, incentives, resources and action plan, but you don't have a vision of what to do. We have all experienced this. This leads to confusion. Kuch karte hain. Let's do something. What to do? It doesn't matter, we don't know. But let's do something. Right? If you have the vision, but if you don't have the skills, but incentives are there, people are aligned, resources are there, action plan, you get anxiety. I would say Indian knowledge systems right now is in the phase of anxiety. We have to acknowledge this to ourselves. We are anxious because we see the value, but we don't know yet how to do it. And that is okay, that is necessary adversity for us to pass through. It is necessary because the vision is right. And hopefully I have communicated in the morning session some moral reasons why this is critical. It is not critical just because it makes us feel good. It is critical because without that, the planetary future is at stake. The same knowledge systems that have generated the crisis cannot be the knowledge systems that we depend on for solution. That is, as per Einstein, the definition of insanity. So you need a diverse knowledge system. There is a case for Indian knowledge system. There is an inheritance that we have that is valuable to the future. Sri Aurobindo says you belong to the future dawns, not to the past noons. Rishi Vakya is there with us. They are clearly saying, Swami Vivekananda says, one thing I see as clearly as daylight is ancient mother rising up to take her throne. Saying this when we were at our lowest. How can we not be a little bit more confident today when we are so much more powerful? What does it take for somebody to say this in 1893? When you are at your lowest, you go out to Chicago and say, I represent the ancient order of monks. And I have come from the land that has given refuge. That is epoch defining kind of consciousness, right? If you have vision skills, but if you don't have incentives, you will get a lot of resistance. It's very important in policy thinking that you are able to strategically define what is the issue. Is the issue not having a vision? Is the issue not having skills? Is the issue of incentive alignment? Is the issue of resources? Is the issue of action plan? If you have all the things and if you don't have the resources, then you get frustrated. If you have all of that, but if you don't have the ability to translate that into action, then you would get false start. You will start something, it will fail. And when it fails, it creates a negative impact for everyone else. That is why this dialogue or this act of Indian knowledge systems and school of, these are all very responsible policy level, strategic level initiatives. We need to ask ourselves very clearly, do we have all five? And it is okay if we don't have, because once we identify the problem, we can build on it. But it's important. I would say our work, if you're looking at Indian knowledge systems to realize that policy vision, is to move from anxiety to change. Because we are right now, there is some traction, there are some incentives, there are some resources, there is some action plan, but we need to develop those skills. And that is, to young people who are starting out, it is the greatest creative opportunity you can have. To take a paradigm of thinking, being, living, and creatively engaging with reality coming from a different paradigm and creating a new way, which is a synthesis, but at the same time a surplus. There is no bigger creative challenge. There is no ask or a call for talent greater than this. It has to become that. But it has to be understood in its full entirety before we take it up excitedly. That it is a formidable challenge, right? So this is the art of managing complex change. I think this is important to recognize. Why is public policy distinct? Firstly, because state itself is an artificial entity. This idea that we will forego certain freedoms and create something that has a monopoly of violence is an artificial idea. It's not a natural idea. It's something that humans devised and created, right? And the scope of public policy is vast. If government says today that it is COVID and you cannot get out of your home, I don't have an exception, you don't have an exception. It's a sledgehammer, it's a carpet bomb. It's not a precision tool, it's not a surgery. Public policy is always a club. It will batter everything. State action is like that, right? But within that, there are diverse actors. Look at the Kashmir problem or look at the Manipur issue right now. You don't even know what is the definition of right. Because there are so many different kinds of actors and each of them has their own definition of success, which is what in public policy literature is called the wicked problem. Rittel, for those who are interested in that. Wicked problems are those where the definitional clarity of a problem, definitional clarity of actors, their incentives, or their agreement of what is the state that they want to be is not clear. So that's why there's a lot of groping in the dark, right? And a lot of public policy is like that. I would say Indic knowledge systems has come out of that. It's not a problem where there is multiplicity of criteria. We have some established criteria. There is also solidarity around it. We all agree that this has to happen. It's a question of finding out how it can happen. What courses we need to create, which discipline, how do we build the faculty development. These problems are solvable problems. This is not a definitional alignment related problem. But why is public policy complex? You have to think, this is from the work of Daniel Bell in a great book called Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. He says, think of these as 4 different realms, 4 different areas. And each of that realm operates on its own logic. Take the idea of politics. What is the first concern of a politician? Power. By extension, the need to get elected. Access to power. And in a democracy, how do you get elected? By maximum votes. Which means what do you need to do? If you need to please the maximum, what do you need to do?
Offering.
You need to keep offering. You need to have nothing called your own opinion. So that I can accept any opinion that's coming. That is, in general, that's how it is. Of course, there is ideology and all of that. But in a we have to have empathy for the politicians in India. They have a much more complex job than any of us can ever imagine. They have to balance such absolutely atrocious expectations and contradicting expectations. And go back every 5 years and hope because if they lose power for the kind of things that they do, they'll either get arrested or get killed. So it's a life of misery. Right? It is a Game of Thrones. That's why once you're in power, you have to keep doing things to stay back in power. Right? Therefore, what do? That is why you expand, you offer. But by offering everything to everyone, they are also talking about market and economic growth. What is the logic of market? Does market offer everything to everyone? It talks about efficiency. Market's logic is input to output. If I'm a producer, how do I use the minimum resources to produce maximum output so that I can increase my profit? Automatically you see a tension between this expansion and this efficiency. Expansion says we'll give it to you for free. Then the producer will say, who will give me money? Then the government say, we will subsidize. Where will government get that money from? By taxing us. Right? So this is the vicious cycle of populism and market, this one. That is one tension. On the other side of the tension is the individual and the collective. Collective operates on certain ideas, right? For example, today equality is a great idea. It has a lot of moral force, very, very critical. Maybe you can say it is not having enough conversation on dignity. That's a different matter, but it's a cultural idea. Equality is a great idea. But the individual wants self-expression. I want to be able to say anything that I want to, freedom of expression. But that affects certain sentiments, which is a group sentiment, right? So there is a lot of natural tension between the individual and collective. Policy comes out, even national education policy and Indian knowledge systems, will come out as a negotiated compromise from all of these things. What we are saying, what we are discussing in the market is, in the morning session was also this. Did the market demand IKS? The market did not demand IKS. Is there any one single advertisement from a corporate which says we want in our job criteria somebody who is equipped with Indian knowledge systems? The day that happens is the day that we will have great traction, right? But till such time, government has to take a lead and say we want this vision. But this is inefficient for a university. You're now talking about all the faculty of physics, economics, management wanting to or being asked to learn something called Indian knowledge systems. It is inefficient, right? Why can't I just, already I have my own admin duties, teaching duties, my papers, my corrections. Why should I learn something new? It's inefficient, right? That's where the policy is critical, because without that, having this dialogue itself is impossible. But it will be a negotiated thing. We all have to develop the temperament. People who are not in IKS have to develop at least a semblance of respect to engage in it. And people who are batting for IKS have to develop both the responsibility, dignity, and the competence to articulate it. That is when this will be productive. Similarly, for the student, individual, I want to get a job. But you're talking about Dharma, which is always also aggregating at collective. Why should I do things that produce surplus for others? Why? I just want to consume. Why should I produce surplus? This is again a dialogue that we need to have. We need to have, because fundamentally it goes back to the thing of, are we in our original natural state, in a very diluted way of asking, good or bad? Yeah. No, I've given the definition that I use for Indian knowledge systems. Indian knowledge systems or Indic knowledge systems is the cultural memeplex or cultural composite of 5 different streams: the Vedic knowledge system, the Buddhist knowledge system, the Jaina knowledge system, the folk knowledge system, and the tribal knowledge system. All of them have philosophy, all of them have truth claim, an ontological claim. They have epistemology, which is their own means of validation. They have axiology, which is their own value system to do that. And they have praxis, which is their way of practice. That is why it's a system. So which means, to answer your question, it is not just the philosophy. It is the applied part of it, it is the science part of it, it is the composite of all the things that we have. For example, in this idea of irrigation, there is a philosophy of irrigation. Like there is, let's say, nature, it has water, all of those things are there. But irrigation is an applied science. Agriculture is an applied science. And that is coming to us from a civilization of actually lived experience with the land. That is scientific. Right? So that is the knowledge system. When we say folk knowledge system, that says that you should plant this seed at this time, that is an experience of living with the nature, the philosophy of that, but also the applied part of when does it yield the best results? What is the science behind it? So it encompasses the science of application. There are very, very good books on this now, because for somebody who's not into this, I can appreciate and understand. I've had this problem myself of understanding this. Kapil Kapoorji's book is there, which is Introduction to Indian Knowledge Systems. Professor Mahadevan has written an Introduction to Indian Knowledge Systems. What are the different elements of Indian knowledge systems, particularly from sciences? He's given us the nomenclature and the taxonomy. A beautiful, very, very good new book has come to us from Mohan Raghavanji of IIT Hyderabad, who talks about the elements of Indian knowledge systems. And that is a department of heritage science and technology. He comes to it from a computer science background. And he talks about yoga, Ananda, Vedanta, metaphysics, using the applied and scientific vocabulary. I would highly recommend that book. Right? So these are the tensions that we have in any policy making. So one way to understand and separate the politics and policy, politics is always a contest of ideas. Therefore, you have statements like sabka saath, sabka vikas. Because you need to expand so much. You need to include. It's a specific temperament. And nature of politics is always negotiation, adaptation, compromise. Because it feels bad or it feels like we can laugh at it. We'll have to understand the importance of this by imagining the absence of it. If you do not solve a problem for negotiation and adaptation, what is the way to solve problem? Violence. If I'm not able to convince you, I will not give up what I want. I'll find violent ways to do what I want. That is why politics is so critical. It is crucial to human societies. We have a very negative affiliation to politics, but it is not. It is the Rangasthala. And that is how the Indian knowledge systems will look at it. That is what Mahabharata will tell you. Krishna had to go to the Kuru Sabha and negotiate. That is politics. Why did he do that? Somebody asked him, this is not going to succeed. You're going to the epicenter of evil. Why are you doing this? He says, still even Ainanu Veliravali, in Telugu, Aina Veliravali Hastinaku. Even then I need to go to Hastina. Because the procedural justice demands that I am seen as doing the right thing. That is what creates the surplus when I have to inflict violence. That is when people will understand that I have tried my best. I need to accrue that goodwill by this action so that when time comes for me to take a decisive action, I have exhausted all other options and therefore it is legible. Therefore it is dharmic. If I didn't try this, it's not dharmic. Right? So that's why it's not. That's why we have to study Mahabharata. Because this is the Rangasthala of life. Policy is always about criteria and classification and all of that. It's a great series. I don't know how many of you have seen it. Yes, Minister. Old series, BBC. It's the genius of their creativity that helps us understand what policy making is and how it is hijacked by administrators to create rules. But fundamentally, a good definition that comes to us from some books is a policy comes out when it is politically acceptable, when it is socially desirable, when it is technologically feasible, when it is financially viable, and administratively doable. You have to have all these things. So next time when you say Indic knowledge systems and this one, firstly, what is the macro climate? In a university like Amrita, it's more feasible. But if I have to talk Indic knowledge system, let's say in JNU, or if I go to DU, then I'll have to look at what is the operating climate there. Right? We can't have again, that is what culture is. I'm able to say Indic knowledge systems, and even if you don't believe it in fully, we have a cultural understanding of listening to each other in this space. Right? And if we understand each other, then it's great. But some places, it is openly hostile. And they are also our students. They are also our future. We need to go out and talk and reason. Right? It has to be socially desirable. We have to generate this understanding in parents, in industry, that Indic knowledge systems is a social good. And I've made the case for it. Today, if you look at the corporate culture and what is going on in the name of diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, it is a dilution of human potential. We have to make this socially desirable because without this, human potential is going towards agitational causes, not productive ones. Right? Technologically, it has to be feasible. We have to create these courses online and all of those things. It has to be financially viable. The greatest challenge that we have is that young people who we are asking to learn Indic knowledge systems should have a shot at a decent career by the end of it by virtue of Indic knowledge systems. Can we generate that or not? Right? And administratively, we cannot expand to 10 courses or 15 courses or whatever. Administratively, it should be doable. So my recommendation when you think about civilizational policy thinking of IKS is how can you make it a good change management exercise which has vision, skills, resources, and incentives and plans, action plan. How can you make it all this 5 framework? How can you make sure that it is politically available and acceptable? Socially, it is desirable. Industry accepts it. Financially, people get rewarded, and administratively, it is doable so that we all sustain. Dharma is sustainability. It has to sustain, right? So that is some of the questions. I'll pause here. I know we have another 20 minutes. I will quickly talk about at a macro level when we say civilizational policy making, what it is or what are the differences. But before that, if there are questions or thoughts, I'll just take a pause. Prospect, right? Dharma is not about ignoring it and doing what you want to do, hoping that it will sort itself out. Dharma is strategizing to defeat that thought and doing whatever is required to defeat that thought. Even that is Dharma. Dharma is fundamentally fighting adharma. But you have to be clear, you have to be responsible, you have to obviously have the right sort of this one. Anything that is polluting ecology at a level where it is affecting everyone, it is adharma. Right? Now, fight here does not mean we'll wage a physical war. It means policy, it means alliances, it means invoking international laws, it means creating alternate technologies which are superior, all of this. But with the goal of defeating that. So Dharma is not passive acceptance or rejection of a danger. It is the exact opposite. Dharma is Kurukshetra. Dharmakshetra is Kurukshetra. And Kurukshetra is Dharmakshetra. So yeah, it's a very important thing. And a lot of people, and this is how young people rationalize, like why should? They're not doing this at a nation state level, but they're doing it at level, all of us, not just young people, that why cannot I optimize for my own satisfaction? Why should I think about a larger this one? That is a way of thinking that does not recognize.
Actually, even Dr. Jayashankar was saying the same thing when
Yeah.
he was consistently being questioned about why India is buying oil from Russia.
Yeah.
He said that we have to look after our interests.
We have to. And that is dharmic. You cannot have, forget apad dharma, where there's a different this one. That's why dharma we have to understand deeply. It is samanya, vishesha, apad, all of it together. But it is tied to the consciousness of the individual. And in this case, consciousness of the nation. It is absolutely, and there are many intricacies to why we are buying oil. In fact, we are buying because Europe itself wants us to buy in a very weird way. Because we need to create the surplus so that it is not taken by somebody else. Because India is still seen as a responsible actor. Tomorrow, if we have a surplus, the world is more assured that it will be spent right. There is also that dimension. Right? But yeah, absolutely. We have to do what is right for us. We have to build resources when there is an opportunity to build resource and use it in the service of nation building. But if that means waging a war with somebody, then where is Dharma? So these are all contextual, very subtle questions. The more you go into it, the more. And that is why Mahabharata becomes, or Ramayana becomes so critical. Because these are not questions that we can answer through our own limited intelligence. Doesn't matter how smart we are. We have to tap into the collective cultural wisdom and develop that Dharma Drishti. That is why rishis are those great exalted beings who are able to see the nth order consequence of an action. Maybe we can see 1, 2, at max 3 orders of our action, the consequence, the third order consequence. At a Ratha level, we spoke about Ratha in this one, it is the perception of the universal pattern, including time and large scales of spaces. To perceive that and distill that down into a societal context is Dharma. So that it can be behavior for the multitude. Sorry, you had a question.
You were mentioning about no much point in telling the students about the greatness of India. I mean, when we tell that this
No,
we
it's
have.
not about not telling greatness. What is the starting point of that conversation? The starting point of the conversation, if we say India is great, unfortunately, you are met with cynicism. I'll tell you, in my own time, life experience, right? When I was growing up, if somebody elderly told me, go to this temple on a Saturday and do pradakshina for 10 times, I will do it. And then I will decide for myself whether that is valuable or not. That is anubhuti. The epistemology there is anubhuti. Nobody else needs to validate it. It's self-validated. But today, because the education and the culture has given so much of emphasis on the analytical cognitive dimension at the expense of spiritual and emotional and psychological dimension, that the first question will be why 10 times? Why on that day? Why right to left? Why not this? People in America are not doing this, but America is a richer country. All of these questions are coming to us from a limited idea of space-time, from that one life. Why should I do it? We become transactional with ourselves actually. That's why a better way to start is understand their current position. Say you want happiness. What is your definition of happiness? Okay, I will feel happy if I get this. For example, an imaginary conversational student. How do you think you can achieve it? By studying this or whatever, right? How do you think you can prepare better by that? If I can get more focus, I think I am good. Now you are in the realm of Indic knowledge system. How do you get more focus?
So, Mike, actually, the question was like, there is a term called pizza effect. So maybe you might know that. So, like, pizza was originated in Italy.
Yeah.
When Americans re-exported to Italy, they go to know their roots. I mean, pizza is the root. I mean, pizza is rooted in Italy.
Yeah.
So it's similar to like when Gandhi wrote letter to the Tolstoy, where Tolstoy wrote a letter back, and Tolstoy was quoting Veda, Tirukural, Gita, and all.
Yeah.
So even in 48 Laws of Power, Robert Greene was quoting Chanakya and all.
Yeah.
So my point is like, how could we re-export those things to our students in a very holistic way, in different ways?
Yeah.
So
that is the creative challenge. For example, absolutely right, because their starting points are there. It is always education design, learning design is always near to far. Unfortunately, today they are nearer to that and farther to the Indic knowledge system, right? So you have to find near hooks and find markers along the way for them to connect to this. That is why the question of, you're absolutely right, I would approach it the same way. For example, that is why I use the design language, because design language is something that people find aspirational. So we can say, have you seen Interstellar? Yeah, I've seen Interstellar. Have you seen Matrix? Yes. Have you seen Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones? Have you seen this? What is the central spiritual theme? Have you seen Matrix? What is the central spiritual theme? So you're starting from a point of interest that they have. Do you know that Coen brothers studied Upanishad? Do you know that George Harris and the entire Beatles team spent time in Rishikesh? Do you know that people like Zuckerberg and all of these guys, Jobs and everyone spent time in this one, along with of course other philosophies? The challenge is we cannot just leave it at that. That just becomes a hook. If you don't supply the next three things, then it becomes like, okay, it's an interesting tidbit, but it's not knowledge. Now, if you have to generate that interest, the dialogue has to sustain. I agree with you that we have to have the pizza effect. That's one good technique. But there might be others. For example, if I go to school, children don't have that other exposure yet. There we need to start directly from this one, so that we don't have to do that roundabout detour. But yeah, we should. Which means that we should become consumers and very critical examiners of world culture. We have to keep surveying the world and interpret everything that we see in the world from the Dharma point of view and have an opinion. Then every time we have a conversation, we are immediately able to find linkages. We have to be so interested in the world. Summarize everything in the world as a good habit for our own something that we do this way. Look at everything in the world, but say, what is the Dharma of this? What would a Dharma opinion on this look like? What is the equivalent of this in our Itihasa? What is the story that comes to our mind when we think about this? If I say a world leader, what is the archetype from our civilization? Is he a Nakula? Is he a Bhima? Is he a... So I interpret constantly the entire world through my lens. So I'm not out of touch, but at the same time, I'm rooted. This is, again, the faculties that we need to develop as practitioners of Indic knowledge systems. Because we have a challenge that we are trying to help people recognize the loss of something that they do not know exists or existed. If you know something is there and you lost it, then you can feel it. If you do not even know and somebody tells you that you lost it, it's a double order work. I have to first help you see that there was a loss. then I have to help you see how to recover that loss. I was having a conversation with my daughter. She's 13 years old. The emphasis on mother tongue, regional language. We do a lot of work at Brhat on that because words and word related meanings are the building blocks of everything else. Nama Rupa is the basis for everything else. So I was driving her back from school and I played a song because I want her to get interested in Telugu literature, Telugu, this one. And there was a song that was playing. And she, the question is always same. Can you understand this song? I don't understand. And there was disinterest. Right? There was this, why should I understand this song? Right? Not that she's too interested in music, but she said, do you understand what the singer is saying? No, I don't understand. The singer, basically the metaphor in the song was, all the three worlds should become the braids in your hair. It's the hero who is singing to the heroine. I said, do you like if somebody sings like this to you in your own imagination? I said, yeah, absolutely, I love it if somebody listens. But do you understand that cultural expression is not possible without this language? Because mullo kalu, three lokas, can only come from a Indian philosophy, from that language. Would you want such a beautiful expression of love to get lost? Okay, no. Then tell me what is the next line. Again, that is the culture. People will like, and I keep saying this, when we talk about cultural storytelling at Brhat, intangible heritage, Rama's story, Rama is the Maryada Purushottama. For somebody who's already having that, it's already their love for Rama in this land is, it can never be taken away, right? But today's culture, I will identify with Rama if Rama can connect me to a life situation that I have. So for example, when I am going through my fundamental emotions of anxiety, jealousy, envy, rejection, joy, whatever that emotion is, if at that time there is a story from Rama's life where he also experienced that and something happened and that elevated his action, therefore it gives me some hope, then I will connect to Rama. If I say that in Chitrakoot at this time when Rama was at his lowest is when he met, for example, someone, in Kishkinda he met, wherever, right? He met someone and that great friendship brought him out of despair. He was wailing, and this is what literature is. If you read Ramayana, the ache that Rama has for those of us is so identifiable because it is so universal. All of us go through that. It is just that we've lost the transmission mechanism because of language, because of culture, because of Western dominated modernity. But if I'm able to tell you that this piece of land is where he rediscovered from his depths of anxiety the meaning of life. Next time you go to that place, next time that place is attacked, then you are more likely to respond because the story is talking to you in a personal way. That is the job that we have. When we say cultural storytelling, at Brhat we do three things: cultural storytelling, Indic knowledge system education, and leadership development. But it is the cultural storytelling that will make the consciousness and the awareness rise. And that has to be supplied and met with the Indic knowledge systems. People are not going to come to Nyaya Shastra, Vedanta, Yoga directly. People will come to the story of their life. You have to be there in the moments of their life, saying, here is something from our heritage which is meaningful to you. It can be products, it can be experiences, it can be stories, it can be relationships. It is a lifetime's work. We are looking at easily 1-2 generations of this work. And that is, if that is not an exciting challenge, then what is? That's why we are here. That it is meaningful, it is something that is needed in the world, and it is something that is creative for our own fulfillment. Right? So I absolutely agree with you, but we should take that as a starting point. I am increasingly finding them. Because mental health, fundamentally, it's a big pandemic. Everybody is talking about this. Our courses, it's a way that you have to present. Of course, this interest, there is a larger movement also. Decolonization from a academic cultural perspective, that's happening. History is a hugely contested. There is a tremendous surge of awareness now that our history has been hijacked. So any history education is this one. You're looking at that in media, film media. Look at Kashmir Files, all new kind of movies are coming which are finding commercial success. So therefore, research in history, what is the real story of our land, is becoming very, very hot topic, right? And what will happen is that the critically thinking individuals from this set will first move. Of course, my sample set is also biased because I am in that sphere. I am not looking at the vast amount of students that you might be looking at, might not be there, but within that there is a tremendous resurgence. You look at the content consumption trend in India today, the content around Indic history, Indic courses, Indic philosophy has risen tremendously in the last 3-4 years. Now it has gotten policy push in the idea of NEP. Now it is being institutionalized as IKS centers, as IKS policy research initiatives. Tomorrow, 29th and 30th, we are signing an MOU with IKS Center as a partner. Then there is also the FDP program that's happening for 1,000 faculty. I am in HRDC Nagpur 2 weeks after that to do that. So this is happening. There is a nice flywheel effect that is coming in, where interest from the culture and supply from the institutions is beginning to happen.
He is our director of CIR, Corporate Industrial Management. Brahmachari Vishwanathananda.
Krishna.
What are the force multipliers in the system? Is there a way to accelerate
We have articulated this on the Brhat website. Firstly, there is a collective yearning, and that story has to be brought out. That this is a wounded civilization now looking to rise up again. That is the macro story that is there. And that's a story that is deeply personal to all of us. It doesn't even matter what religion it is. Culturally, it ties us, right? Secondly, hero movements. The force multiplier is always 1 or 2 hero movements which will then galvanize. Think about Sai Deepak ji's book. Think about some of the podcasts, Ami Ganatra ji's work that's happening there. What we are doing as this one institution. That is the force multiplier where you have hero movements. Because how does perpetuation happen? Perpetuation happens when there is a seeking or a yearning. There's a time, moment in time, which is met with something which exemplifies or which actually shows what good looks like in that yearning. Then that becomes a mimicable behavior. People want to mimic it. If for nothing else, they might not even agree with the idea, but they want to mimic the person or they want to mimic that trend, right? Then you have diffusion technology. What is produced in one way as a mimicable habit is now diffused very quickly through technology all over the world. It is the same set that has been used by the liberal ideology to spread it. I spoke in the morning session about the 6 units of analysis, from Western nation states to artists to technologists. We need to use the same processes and same structures to spread what we think is right. So you have an earning, you have a hero movement, you have folk generated around that hero movement that has to be mimicable, and that mimicable behavior has to be scaled through technology to create perpetuation. And that is where you need institutions, which is exactly the purpose that we put down on our website. That we call ourselves the culture engine. We need a culture engine to keep adding to the flywheel.
So how they made the Mickey Mouse a world
It is.
global icon, so to speak?
That is the power of creativity.
The whole process, you have to reverse it.
Yeah. Take our own
So from
icons
our own-
and make
yeah.
it. But there is the challenge we have is when they were doing it, there was no North Star. Today, most of Indians have already also consumed those experiences. So they have sophisticated sense in that level of creativity. So if you offer something from your tradition which is not up to that standard, you don't have the luxury of the discovery that they had. So you will have to get to a certain acceptable degree of sophistication and quality by definition, which means our work is harder, but therefore it's also more creative. They will reject it if it's not sophisticated.
I liked your idea when you said, you have to look at global experience and
Yeah.
then connect to the culture.
Yeah.
Recently in one of the classrooms, I was discussing colonialism and how people still would not, even our own generation, are not even identify the need for decolonization.
Yeah,
Because the pain and the experience our ancestors have gone through,
Yeah.
completely lost on them.
it is.
So freedom fighters, having honestly, they don't connect.
They don't. And that is the very act of nation building. Unless we tell those stories, you don't have a sovereign nation.
So I used one rule. There's one handle called African Archives.
Yeah.
So there, I think one of the African countries, the punishment for a worker for not producing enough for the day was to chop off the hand of of their children. And there are photographs of so many children with no hands. So I portrayed that to them. See, when you say you don't understand it, and suddenly for them, for that
It
moment,
strikes. Yeah.
their whole consciousness shifted.
Yeah.
So what I believe is we have to connect back to our history, to the global history, see those poignant moments.
Yeah.
So it is that wake up call, no?
It is.
It has to happen for it. That is when they shift the whole,
That's why I said the morning session was cognitive shift. It
I
is
missed
that
it,
cognitive
I was
shift.
not aware. I would have happily been there.
It is almost like getting a new pair of eyes, seeing it for the first time. You come to the point where you are actually seeing it for the first time.
Yes.
Once you do it, you find it everywhere. I go in a lift, right? 6-year-old speaking wonderfully rustic Telangana Telugu. And because I am there, and whatever perception the mother might have had, there is a societal pressure that the mother put on herself to force the kid to speak in English. The kid is speaking in Telugu. She is forcing a response and she is goading that kid to speak in English because, not because of anything else, but because there is somebody else who you want to signal that we also belong to the English class. That has become aspirational. And I was consciously engaging with the kid in Telugu. It's what we need to do. This is happening in our lives, in our communities. We run a series called Swarnanjali, where the whole idea is to reconnect the fundamental act of reclaiming our language through the great literature, not through politics, through the aspiration setting of great literature, and thereby generating a new cultural consciousness. To make something authentic from our culture as the aspiration, so that the social media trend can be on good Hindi, good Telugu, good Tamil, good Malayalam.
To extend it, because I am involved in the placement, so I was talking to recruiters. I was telling, we will happily give you our students if you say that mother tongue is mandatory, So we have to move to a space where these all have to be as policies of companies, where they naturally embrace these ideas in their own policy making. Then I think we would.
Yes, we have to demand that.
The trend will set.
We have to absolutely. I said when we get job description saying Indic knowledge systems is preferable. It's a goal that I've set for myself, and we've said, and there are two things. One is of course because we're talking about IKS and the way we think about it, there are 5 factors that need to come together as IKS policy, and we engage with all 5. That's the work that we've given ourselves. The first one is policymaker. Like we said, political decision making is the most difficult. We are the unreasonable ones, not them. We have to give them a lot of hope and signal that IKS is something that is good. Otherwise, they don't have a reason to do it. They have 100 other issues which get them political capital. It is not a political issue. History writing, they can introduce some, but paradigm like Indic knowledge systems is not. So we need to keep, all of us need to keep talking to policymakers or create documents or create interactions where we say, we like this. They need to feel comfortable that this is good. Next is academic leadership. Somebody has to take the leap of faith and introduce these programs. Yes, it's not going to be perfect in year 1, year 2. I'm super happy and excited to know this center has been there for so many years.
Actually, he is the founder.
I'm sure.
He only gave me the patent.
Okay. It's been there much before it was fashionable.
We started in 2003 or 4, no?
3 of us, imagine. And it's been there. That's the parampara. Not just here. If you go to any traditional institution, that's been there. It's just that some of us are discovering IKS for the first time and we feel excited about it. Third is the industry leaders. We have to have IKS summits happening in universities with industry leaders. Fourth is parents. We need a mission, a national mission to talk to parents. IKS is culture which is values. For the first time, and I'm saying this responsibly, for the first time in this great civilization which has withstood so much of oppression, we really have the danger of not being able to transmit our culture. Because this threat is a different kind of threat. There, the enemy, a Britisher or whoever it is, clear. Right? You could recede into your house and you could do your ritual and you can do your this one. But today, the enemy is not that, the enemy is in your house. It's the ideology that has seeped in. The idea of individuality, the idea of language, the idea of the globalized culture, the atomic individual, everything structural as oppressive. This is a generation where parents and kids are fighting over ideology, which was never the case. And lastly, the learners. So we need to have a specific communication strategy, a specific empathy, a specific technique to engage with all these five, which is what we're trying to do at Brhat.
Raghavji, the presentation is.
I don't want to get into political philosophy and this one. What is the definition that we have? Right? It's the idea of Rita, Rina, Dharma. It's a Kartavya based society. That's why I'm actually, while there's a lot of criticism about terms and all, but when Modi ji says this is Kartavya Kal, I'm actually very excited. Because for the first time in public discourse, we are bringing in right. Not as a this one, but our duty. That this is Amrit Kal, you can demand things from government, that's your right, but you have a Kartavya. This is Amrit Kal as Kartavya Kal. I think that's a very powerful framing. But that goes back to our fundamental philosophy that we are born in a civilizational debt. The debt to our ancestors, the debt to nature, the debt to our devas, the debt to rishis, and the debt to each other. Because that's how, without any of this, we are not there. So our job is to work Panchamahayagna or Rina Tapas, right? If there is one thing that I hope as a policy that happens in every organization, particularly state organizations, is simply introduce the ritual of Panchamahayagna every day. The 5 obeisance. You just need to do it as a ritual. Because that consciousness it generates, if you just offer something every day to the nature, to ancestors, to your rishis, to each other, that is a tremendous force. Right? Dharma is action according to that. Now, who is a policymaker? Because none of this can happen without leadership. And we know, we get from civilizational knowledge systems, what is the ultimate idea. The ultimate idea in the Indian conception is Indriya Jaya. That you have to be a master of your senses. Whether it is yoga, whatever it is, all schools agree on this. Right? That is the way to get to the elevated consciousness. So can we, when we say state as the enabler of purushartha sadhana and greatest potential of the human, then we need to say what are the means that state is offering to overcome Arshad Varga, to get Indriya Jaya, to actually look at the best of us, taking the best of positions for the greater responsibility. So those are the kind of policies. Fundamentally, all of this, why do we need? Because any nation has 3 concerns, just the way an individual has. The question of who we are, it's the question of identity. The question of how do we come together to do something, stability. And the question of how do we flourish, which is the question of prosperity. This can happen only when we tap into the civilizational inheritance and the wisdom that we have. Because some of the ideas that we have imported are hardly 400 years old and they're already reaching their precipice. You have a far greater, far more time-tested philosophy. Civilizational public policy is rooted and it is needed because the fundamental quest of an individual or a nation of identity, stability or prosperity cannot be met unless the state is thinking about it in civilizational terms. That is why we need it. All right. Cool. Those are this one. That is why IKS is national strategy for me. IKS is not an academic strategy. IKS is answering fundamental link between individual aspiration and the role of the state in that. And without IKS, I will go out on a limb and claim this. Without the Indian knowledge systems, we won't have an India in the next 20-25 years. The kind of demographic, geopolitical, geostrategic threats that we are facing, without fundamentally re-altering the minds of young people towards our knowledge system, towards a different idea of life, you will lose territory. This will come to actual land level issue. It's not just about some abstract definition. It will happen. That is why this is urgent work.